Today, the Intelligence Committee in the House interviewed the Trump campaign's digital director, Brad Parscale, as well as one of President Trump's personal lawyers and a former Trump Organization executive, a man named Michael Cohen. These are both closed-door interviews today, but CNN reporter Manu Raju was nevertheless able to report that the Michael Cohen interview with the Intelligence Committee was, quote, contentious. Tell me more. Michael Cohen